Please just give me a sign that you can hear me and I will begin. Anybody? Thank you very much. Okay. Hi, so I'm Aura. I noted on the chat that the sources are now available on the website. I won't weary you by talking about how alienating it is to teach in this format. I'm sure we've all been talking about it for the past year. It's extremely alienating. So I just needed to say that at the outset. I would appreciate it if you could at least note questions that you might have or comments on the chat. It'll be really helpful for me in future, the future lessons, that I can orient my thoughts and my remarks to your expectations. So since I don't know who you are and I won't be able to hear anything from you during the lesson, I would at least like to know what you're thinking and how I might make it a better learning experience for everybody. Okay, so I'm going to start with a few words about what I want to do in this series, and I'll just start with my title. I chose a provocative title, in a sense, how the Baal Shem Tov changed the world. Provocative because you might want to argue with me that, well, how did he change the world? He didn't change the world at all, or other people changed the world more. So I guess I want to just relate for a few minutes to what exactly I mean by that, and talk as we go along. This first lesson will be more historically oriented. The rest of the units of the course, I'd like to look more closely at sources and at ideas and concepts, major figures. But I feel that before we can really talk about Hasidism or Hasidut in any kind of circumspect way, we do need to put it first into historical context, and second into a more academic context of what we know about Hasidut, and as we look at the different trends in academic research, I think it does give more a sense of the complexity of trying to understand Hasidut as a phenomenon. And my final point in this whole presentation today is to present my own take on Hasidut and the way that I am going to be reading the sources. So again, context is important here. How the Baal Shem Tov changed the world. What world exactly are we talking about? I guess one answer to that question, we could say the changing the world has to do with the course of history, of Jewish history. Perhaps we could also say that there are other worlds in question. Maybe we're not talking about the world and the course of external events, but rather internal worlds. And that's the direction that I'm going to go into. I personally am much more interested in the teachings of Hasidut and the way that they affect internal worlds. In other words, the way that we as Jews live our Judaism. And I'll just put all the cards on the table. I like Hasidut. I'm interested in it not only intellectually, but also on a personal level. And so I guess the approach that I'm going to adopt throughout my teaching is, why does this matter to us? So just to conclude this first point, I'd like to refer for a minute to the picture that Torah in Motion connected to my series. They didn't ask me about it, but I thought it was really very interesting. If you probably remember when you registered, there's a photograph of two little Hasidic boys with payas and velvet kippot, and we see them from the back. They look really cute. They were rolling around in the grass. One of them has little pieces of grass stuck to a sweater, but we see them from the back. And that's really, I think, something very symbolic about the study of Hasidism in general. Most of the people who have tried, of the academics who have tried to understand Hasidism as a historical phenomenon or as a religious phenomenon or as an ideological phenomenon, have looked at it from the back, from the outside, and have tried to understand it as outsiders. That's understandable. Academics are supposed to be objective, and indeed, research on Hasidism has come to a tremendous understanding of Hasidism as a phenomenon. On the other hand, I feel that there's something that's sort of been missing, that we can't get those little boys to turn around. And so the approach that I'm going to try to take in the majority of the course is to sort of sneak around to the other side and try to look Hasidism in the face and see what really is the draw, or was the draw, or has been the draw of Hasidic teaching, and perhaps in the end get to some kind of conclusion about Hasidism, how Hasidism might actually change the world. Okay, so let's look at my source sheet here. All right, I'd like to start. Is it big enough? Should I make it bigger? Anyone want to tell me? Maybe I'll make it slightly bigger since I can't hear anyone telling me anyway.
You can make it bigger yourself. Thank you.
I can make it bigger. Wait, that's a little too big. How's that? Is that okay?
Yes.
Is that good enough?
That's
Great.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. All right. So we are going to start, before we actually get into our more heavy historical sources. I'd like to start with the Hasidic teaching here. This first one in this today, I'm going to basically focus on the English. The sources from Hasidic writings I have here in Hebrew. For those who know Hebrew, the formulations of them are not essential at the moment, so I'm just going to focus on the English. Okay, so the author here is Rabbi Moshe Chaim Ephraim of Sudikov. His book is called The Degel Machane Ephraim, and he is the grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. His mother was the Baal Shem Tov's daughter. Okay, so this particular teaching is based on the pasuk in Parashat Yitro at the beginning of Matan Torah, when the remark is made that the people saw the sounds, va'am ro'im et hakolot, which of course is a paradox because we can't see voices, we can hear them, but that's the point that's being made here. So the Rabbi Moshe Chaim Ephraim tells a parable that he heard from his grandfather. So I heard from my grandfather a parable. There was a musician who played so beautifully with such sweetness that all who heard his melody could not restrain themselves. They danced nearly up to the ceiling in pure pleasure. And the closer one drew to hear the sounds flowing from his instrument, the greater was the enjoyment, causing one to dance yet more intensely. By and by, a deaf man came along. He could hear nothing of the wondrous melody, but he saw the others dancing with all their might. He thought they were mad and muttered to himself, "What are they so joyous about?" Truly, though, had he been wiser and more discerning, he would have realized it was all from the power of the music, and he would have danced too. The meaning of the parable is clear. Now, of course, when they say that it's clear, that actually, of course, means it's not clear at all. I will tell you what I want to do with this parable. I think it is loyal to what the Degel wanted to say. My point here being that if you look at Hasidut from the outside, you think they're all crazy. What are they dancing to? What are they getting so excited about? In effect, all the people who looked at Hasidut from the outside were deaf, are deaf. In other words, if we want to understand anything about the music, we have to believe that there's music here, and that if we could only hear it, there's something enjoyable about it. So that's I would like maybe to say one other thing, that reading a Hasidic text, which we've sort of done here in a very few seconds, demands a different kind of reading. It's a slower, more contemplative kind of reading, in which we can't really expect everything to be given right there to us. I would say, of course, reading Jewish sources in general demands that kind of slower contemplative reading. Reading Hasidic texts, I think, requires something additional, and that is that we have to bring ourselves to the text. In other words, we have to believe that these Hasidic masters have something to say to us personally. I won't go on with that now, but I do want to just point that, put that also here on the table, that that's the kind of reading that I'm trying to do, with all the critical intent needed. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything, but I am trying to sort of open us to this mode of reading that causes us to meet the text with ourselves and not just with our minds. Okay, so let's just go down here. This list here of the sort of a timeline, and I'm going to return in the course of this lecture to most of these dates. I just wanted to put them here on the paper for you so you can refer back to them. We're talking about obviously a very long or broad historical context in which the first point here that I will return to is this notion of Hasidut or Hasidim that has many meanings in the course of Jewish history. Before the Baal Shem Tov came along, we'll return to that. Then we have here another three important crises in Jewish history: the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, the Cossack pogroms, known in Yiddish as Gzeres Tachvetat, and the conversion of Shabtai Tzvi to Islam. All three of them crises that overturned Jews on a personal level, and of course changed the course of Jewish history. And then we have the birth of the Baal Shem Tov, the ban on Hasidism, which pretty much marks the end of the period that I'm going to be talking about. In this course, early Hasidism, I will be talking about the Baal Shem Tov and his immediate circle. One of his major disciples was the Maggid of Mezrich, who died in 1772. So that's basically the framework of the course in terms of the end period. Anyway, this is a list to be used as reference as we go along. Okay, so just one other point that I did want to make. I am less interested in talking about opposition to Hasidut or the ways that Hasidism was received in the Jewish world contemporaneous to it. So while I note the Cherem Vilna, the rabbinic excommunication of Hasidism as an important point in the formation of Hasidism, again, that's an outsider perspective, which is not going to be part of the material that I'd like to present in this series. Okay, so now the next important point that I want to devote some time to now is trends in research of Hasidism. It's important, first of all, because I think most of what we know in the educated Jewish world, what we know about Hasidism is based on scholarship, and there are quite a number of misconceptions that, interestingly enough, even though they've been around for 100 years, continue to influence many people in their perceptions of what Hasidism is, what it was, or what it continues to be. So in the next few minutes, I'd like to outline or present the major scholars that have presented various opposing theories about Hasidism. Just one more word about why this is important. In effect, Hasidism is a movement or a phenomenon that has been recognized as changing the Jewish world. The question then is how it arose. What happened all of a sudden that Hasidism appeared on the scene? Was it all of a sudden? Was it not all of a sudden? And how did it have such a profound effect on such broad geographical areas and over such a long historical period? It's a question that has fascinated scholars over the past 100 or 200 years, and it's astonishing that so many different and conflicting theories have been proposed to explain both the appearance of Hasidism and its success. So the first approach that I'd like to discuss is that of social historians. In other words, what we're talking about here is historiosophical approaches to the phenomenon that's called Hasidut. The first one, which I would call a social history, its two major proponents are Shimon Dubnov and Ben-Zion Dinu. The next couple of paragraphs, I took them from a book by Rachel Elior, which she herself has a different approach, but she makes it a nice historical sort of survey of research on Hasidism, so that's what I'm quoting from. Her point here being that both Dinur and Dubno presented Hasidism as a response to crises in Eastern European Jewry in the 18th century. But as she says, they differed in their interpretations. Dubnov notes the Cossack uprising, but if you see here, basically what her point here being is that the rise of Hasidism was as he says here, a response to the deep needs of the despondent soul. We're talking about a period of distress, decline, despair, failure, alienation, spiritual decline, and the inability of the rabbis, in other words, the rabbis of the established Jewish communities, to respond adequately to this crisis. The success of Hasidism, as she writes here for Dubnov, was in the way that it responded to the individual's need for contact with the divine. So this idea of Hasidism as a reactive movement is at the core of Dubnov's reading of history. The second scholar that presented this social historical understanding of Hasidism and its role in Eastern European history was Dinur. He also recognized the crisis, but his approach was more social. Dinur was a Marxist in addition to being a Zionist, and so his emphasis here is the new social message that Hasidism presented. That Hasidism is a response to social oppression and economic exploitation, etc. In addition, he recognized this messianism in the ideology of the Hasidic movement. So here we have a second reactionary theory that explains the emergence of Hasidism, but with a social background. Now, interestingly, and I guess that's maybe something that's well known, but maybe not, most of the historiography of Jewish historiography in the 20th century in general was bound up with Zionism, right? We're talking about most of the major scholars who wrote Jewish history in the 20th century tried to create a grand narrative that included the various crises of Jewish history of the 19th and 20th century, including the Holocaust for the later scholars, together with the founding of the Jewish state. So we have a ideologically harnessed a kind of outlook that then is then applied to understanding the past. We're talking about great historians who made a huge contribution to our understanding of Jewish history. But what Elior is pointing out here is that we have that same ideology sort of caused a certain kind of interpretation that maybe doesn't really hold up to the test of reality. So in effect, the drawback of both of these theories, Dubnov's and Dinur's, is that they really don't address anything unique about Hasidism. In other words, all of Jewry of 19th century, 18th century, 19th century Eastern European Jewry suffered in the wake of the Sabbatean movement. They all suffered the same economic distress. They all were victims of the same social conditions, and yet some of them became Hasidic and some of them did not become Hasidic. So that would be the drawback of these two explanations, that they don't address the uniqueness of the Hasidic reaction to reality as opposed to the non-Hasidic reaction. Okay, so now we move on here to the second very, I guess a third or a fourth prominent scholar of Jewish history in general, of Hasidism in particular, Immanuel Etkes. So Etkes here sort of does the same kind of a survey and picks up after Dubnov and Dinur, which is here in the second paragraph, since the 1950s. He brings another point here. One important aspect of these earlier theories was that Hasidism was a popular movement that appealed to simple, unlearned Jews and gave them hope and this personal connection to God, etc. Etkes points out that there's a turn in scholarship of Hasidism in the second half of the 20th century, which here, as he says, scholars today are in agreement that during its initial stages, the phenomenon of Hasidism was narrow in scope, centering around a new approach toward religion and spirituality. In other words, rather than explaining Hasidism as a social or historical phenomenon and reaction to crisis, Etkes points out that later scholars focus more on the ideology of Hasidism and it's the spiritual experience that it presents. Now, the major scholar, the first scholar who developed that approach, of course, was Gershom Scholem. And Scholem's approach, he was a historian of ideas. And in his path-breaking lecture on, or his series of lectures that were published later as Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, published, in 1945, he presented Hasidism in a different context. He presented Hasidism, as you see here, as the third stage or the final stage in the evolution of Jewish mysticism, or devolution, if you want to call it that, in which he notes here three stages: Lurianic Kabbalism, Sabbateanism, and Hasidism. And he says they're all three stages of the same process. Now, what's the difference in this kind of approach? First of all, he basically abstracts Hasidism from the whole economic, social context and presents it as a stage in the evolution of ideas and religious practices. One other important point that I didn't bring it in my quotation here, but important innovation of Scholem was that Hasidism is essentially a psychologization of Kabbalistic ideas. In other words, while Kabbalistic ideas are esoteric and difficult to understand, Hasidism, said Scholem, transformed those ideas into psychological concepts. In other words, if we're talking about the idea of tikkun, whereas in Kabbalah, the idea of tikkun or reparation has to do with esoteric concepts like the Shekhinah, for Hasidut, we talk about tikkun as something that happens in the human soul. We'll go back to this idea in various times, I guess, in the course of our discussion today, and not today so much, but in the future. In any case, what's important to note here is that the realm of discourse that Scholem sort of presented was this idea of that ideas, abstract ideas, evolve and are adopted and transformed from movement to movement. And in order to understand them, you need to trace them backwards. Okay, so I'll return to that point in just a minute. Just one other comment here on Scholem. Here in another history of Hasidism, rather new one, published 2 years ago. The authors here summarize Scholem's contribution to Jewish studies. Hasidism was the latest phase of Jewish mysticism. He argued that the Baal Shem Tov possessed Sabbatean manuscripts and that his movement needs to be understood as a response to Sabbateanism. Now here we have this other important point that Scholem, one of Scholem's major innovations, that Hasidism, as opposed to Sabbateanism, neutralized this messianic element, embraced Jewish law, whereas Sabbateanism was antinomian, and redirected the mystical energies of Sabbateanism from the national plane to the individual. So here again, we have this idea that was central for Sholem, that whereas earlier forms of mysticism, i.e. the Lurianic Kabbalah and Sabbateanism, were messianic, Hasidism was not messianic. Okay, now that point, which I'm not going to pursue right now, has become a huge subject of contention among scholars of Hasidism, whether Hasidism is messianic or not messianic. Of course, the Chabad Rebbe, the latest Rebbe, very much promoted the messianic element of Hasidism. So here again, you can just see that there any given subject can be interpreted over the development of Hasidism in many different ways. We will put Sholem here to the side, and I would like to pursue Sholem's basic approach with the help of one more scholar. I return to Rachel Elior, now speaking in her own voice. We saw her earlier summarizing earlier trends in Hasidism. Elior, I quote here from her book called The Mystical Origins of Hasidism, in which she, here in her beginning, sort of presents her own approach, which we could, that's basically what she's contending here in her title, that Hasidism is a form of mysticism. I'll just read here the beginning. Hasidism originated in a mystical awakening that altered conceptions of the relationship between man and God. She emphasizes this idea of charismatic piety, which has a lot to do with the leaders of Hasidism and how they transmitted Hasidic insights to their followers. Her emphasis here, and what you can see in her general reading of Hasidism, is that it emphasizes mystical experience, visionaries, etc. Now, she does note here that when we connect Kabbalah and earlier forms of Jewish mysticism to Hasidism, it is important to note this continuity. And here I just like to fill in a link that isn't expressed so much here in this small citation that I brought. After the period of flowering of Lurianic Kabbalah in the 16th century, in the, we could say, 80 years or 100 years after the death of Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, Kabbalah, Lurianic Kabbalah went through a very interesting stage of popularization. That there were a number of small Kabbalistic tracts that were printed and reprinted in popular form. Their language was translated into more everyday language. So that as a result, many Jews who were not Kabbalists became familiar with all sorts of Kabbalistic ideas. We see it in many interesting forms in various literatures that become popular through the 17th century, the 16th century and the 17th century. So that actually brings us to the next point that I'd like to discuss a little bit. Before the appearance of the Baal Shem Tov, before his birth, before his revelation in 1736, there were lots of groups of people in many different places who were called Hasidim. These Hasidim were, to an extent, Kabbalists, as in the form that Kabbalah was practiced in the 150 years after the death, after the flowering of the Kabbalah in Tzfat, and throughout the popularization of Kabbalah in the 16th and 17th centuries. These groups of, this is Moshe Rossman's phrase, Hasidism before Hasidism. So this we'll see next week when we talk about the circle of the Baal Shem Tov and his immediate disciples. We'll see that most of his disciples were called Hasidim, or they belonged to these groups that were called Hasidim, even before the Baal Shem Tov came on the scene. So it is a fascinating sort of chapter in Jewish history. What are we talking about? Who were Hasidim before Hasidim, before the Hasidim of the Baal Shem Tov? So what Rossman explains here is that we're talking about Ashkenazic Jewish communities in Germany and Poland. The 17th century marked a renewed commitment to the penitential ideas and practices of the Hasidei Ashkenaz. Okay, now I realize that probably some of my listeners know very well what the German pietists, Hasidei Ashkenaz, who they were. I imagine maybe there's someone who doesn't know, so I'll just address that very briefly. We're talking about small group of people in the 12th and 13th centuries who had these aesthetic practices with the intent of living in a way that would be in total devotion to God. We're also talking about a period that coincides with the Crusades, and the book that became the spokesman for the worldview of the German pietists of the Hasidei Ashkenaz was called Sefer Hasidim. The central figure is Rabbi Yehuda Hasid. He was not necessarily the leader of the Hasidei Ashkenaz, but he's certainly a central figure. And these are the group of people that was most commonly called Hasidim from the 12th century all the way through the 18th century. Now, we know that the word Hasid was used throughout this period to refer to people, even people who had nothing to do with Hasidut, or people who were opposed to Hasidut, as for example, the Gaon of Vilna, who's called throughout the literature HaGaon HaChasid. Obviously, the Hasid in question is not someone who is an adherent to Hasidut, but someone who has these ascetic, very strict stringencies, all related to devotion to God and religious practice. And I guess one other example that is, I think, very striking is the Ramchal, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, which, if you remember, he opens his book Mesilat Yesharim, Yesod HaYesodot, V'Amud HaChasidut, that the root of spiritual practice, Amud HaChasidut, is that a person should know his place in this world. The Ramchal had absolutely no connection to Hasidism, and yet he devotes large sections of his book, Mesilat Yesharim, to the practices of Hasidut, of Hasidism. So I return now here to Rossman. Let's read first what he has to say, and then I'll add some comments. Okay, so we're talking about a reviving of the practices of the Hasidei Ashkenaz. While these precepts and rituals had never lost their moral force, they were now adopted by more people as a way of life, reinforced by ideas appropriated from Sephardic sources and by the influence of Lurianic Kabbalah, with its emphasis on asceticism. Those who combined devotion to mysticism and aesthetic practices were often found attached to two types of associations that served as forums for study and mystical fellowship: the Beit Midrash and the Klois. Okay, here he explains what the Klois is and what the Beit Midrash is. Interestingly, as we'll see, many of these, there was a Klois in most of the major cities in towns in Poland, and in the period in Poland and Russia, in the period that the Baal Shem Tov began to be active. And in fact, as we'll see next week, many of these scholars who were deeply entrenched in the Klois became disciples and followers of the Baal Shem Tov. So on the one hand, we have already a highly developed spiritual fraternity. We have an internal kind of social organization of people who are doing this kind of spiritual work together. And on the other hand, we have this aesthetic and stringent element. What we'll see in next week is that here we have a major transition from this proto or prehistoric kind of Hasidism and its transformation and repair, I guess you could say, in the Hasidism of the Baal Shem Tov. So I'm not going to go on with this. Next week we'll return to this point. What exactly appealed to these Hasidim of the old style, as Rossman called them? What appealed to them in the Hasidism of the Baal Shem Tov? And it's actually, I think this will shed a lot of light on the draw of Hasidism, certainly in this first generation. Okay, I'd like to move on now to the last part of what I'd like to talk about today. Perhaps maybe just talk a few minutes about my approach and what I'd like to do now. My last point here, Hasidic teaching of God consciousness, or to put it another way, a vision of radical divine immanence. So I guess it's important for me just to sort of share with you some of my own struggle in trying to figure out what I think needs to be done in understanding Hasidic teaching and trying to present it in a way that makes sense to the people I'm teaching. So I will say, first of all, like I have a lot of, I feel sort of uncomfortable with phrases such as a vision of radical divine immanence, which has a lot of big words that sound sort of alienating. These are the words that we have to talk about religious concepts or spiritual experience. They're the only words that we have. They're good words, but they don't really go very far in sort of helping us understand what it is that we're talking about. So if I return to the first part of my title here, God consciousness, I guess this is another formulation of the same idea in a way that seems more immediately relevant. Okay, the next two sources that I'd like to look at with you, the first source is a Kabbalistic source. I'm quoting from the Zohar, or I'm bringing a citation from the Zohar, which is not referred to specifically in the Hasidic text that I've brought. It definitely is present there. There's no question that the Baal Shem Tov knew this source from the Zohar. He refers to it, I guess you could say, indirectly. And more than that, I think that there's something very deep, a deep sense of religiosity in the text from the Zohar that the Baal Shem Tov is going to be drawing on in the parable that he presents in the text that we'll see. One last point that I'd like to make before we look at the sources, and that is that there's a tremendous amount that's been written about this particular Hasidic text. Scholars have traced it to various other sources in the Kabbalah, in Midrash, in Jewish sources, in non-Jewish sources. It's a very evocative text. Again, that's certainly interesting to get a circumspect understanding of what's going on in the text. I'm not going to go there right now, but it is important for me to just note that there's a very rich sort of textual background to the text in question. Okay, so we're going to do this one step at a time. I'd like to look at the Zohar first. I won't be reading it in Aramaic. You have it here if you'd like to look at it. The Zohar, it bases itself, you can see it really takes the pasuk from Yeshayahu totally out of context. I won't go into the original context of the Navi, but it doesn't matter because they take it out of context. The pasuk itself is, if you look at it here in the text below, ki tavou le'raot panai. The focus here is on the vocalization of this word le'raot, which as the Zohar points out, li'ot mibaele. It would be more simple to say li'ot with that vocalization means to see. But as we know, this word, okay, it says it to translate in English, when you come to see my face or to be seen before me. The pasuk itself, on the simple meaning, really it would be to be seen before me. The context, of course, is when Jews come to the Beit HaMikdash, to the temple, to see and to be seen. Now that's the double meaning of the Le'raot, which appears, of course, in the Chumash as well. What does that mean? When people come or came to the Beit HaMikdash, they came in order to see what, right? So Chazal say that once a year, the Kohen Gadol would pull away the covering of the Holy of Holies, of the Kodesh Kodeshim, and enable people to see in one way or another. But we have this double meaning of not only the person coming, seeing the holy, but in that same moment, the Hashem sees them. And as we know, everyone wants to be seen. We want to be seen by the people we love. We, of course, want to be seen and heard by God. And that's this very sort of loaded or laden experience that the Zohar is touching on. When you come to be seen before me, or when you come to see my face. So the Zohar asks, what does this mean? Answer or remark, for the king's countenance is wholly hidden, deep beyond the darkness. Yet those who know how to unify the holy name are able to break through all those shadowy walls. Then the face of the king may be seen, radiant before all. Then all the worlds, upper and lower, will flow with blessings. Okay, that's my translation. It's a very poetic text. I hope it sounds comprehensible enough, even though I try to be as loyal as possible to the text. The Zohar is basically asking this question, even on a pshat level, how can you see Hashem? The king, the face of the king is hidden. Now the answer of the Zohar to the Zohar is, okay, Hashem might be hidden, but that's not a given that can't be altered in any way. People who know how to do something called unifying the holy name, that enables them to break through the walls. And when one is able to do that, then you can see the face of the king. Not only that, the seeing and the being seen is a catalyst for something even greater, which is causing the world to flow with blessings. So without going too much into a translation of what those mystical terms mean, we could say that it's something that we would want, a process that we would want to put into motion. If one is able to break through the darkness, the shadows, the walls, break down the walls, something happens, something good, blessings will flow. Okay, so that's the basic sort of the text or the experience that the parable that we're going to read now, it touches on. All right, so this appears in one of the very early Hasidic book called Ben Porat Yosef by one of the Baal Shem Tov's major disciples, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoi, and he prefaces it with the staging of it, as I heard from my master, the Baal Shem Tov, before the blowing of the shofar, a parable. Okay, so the question is that why do we need to stage this? And so just remember that, you know, we're in shul, the Baal Shem Tov is standing before his congregation, and they're about to blow the shofar. And the shofar, as we know, is supposed to do something to us. Like as the Rambam said, you hear the shofar and it means Uvu Yishenim Mishenatchem. Wake up, those who sleep. The shofar is supposed to break down walls, like the shofarot in Jericho that broke down the walls. The the Baal Shem Tov told this parable in order to get people to wake up, to understand something, to do some kind of spiritual work before they fulfill the religious obligation of hearing the shofar. Okay, so here's the parable. There was a great and wise king who created illusory walls and towers and gates. He decreed that all who wished to approach him must pass through those gates and towers. At his order, royal treasures were placed at each and every gate. Some came no farther than the first gate, took the treasure and left. Others pressed onward to the second or the third, took some gold coins and retreated. But the king's beloved son was driven by longing to see his father. And when at last he overcame all obstacles and reached the king, he realized that nothing had ever stood between them. All the walls and towers and gates were an illusion. And the meaning of this is clear for those who understand hidden things. So I heard from my master of blessed memory. When we realize that the whole earth is filled with his glory, and that our every movement and thought flows from God, then all the workers of iniquity shall be scattered. Indeed, even the angels and all the heavenly dwellings, everything in existence is infused with his essence, like the snail whose garment is part of itself. Finally, with the power of this knowledge, the workers of iniquity shall be scattered. For in truth, there is nothing, no barrier, no veil that separates a person from God. May he be blessed. Okay, I'd actually just like to do here in the few minutes that remain is focus for a second on this image that he gives you at the end, like the snail whose garment is part of itself. It's actually, that's a phrase from the Midrash. Basically, what it makes tangible is this idea that of what we call divine immanence, that Hashem is everywhere. At the highest possible level of experience, it means that there's not even a distinction between where Hashem is and who I am and where Hashem isn't. He's everywhere. Just as you can't distinguish between the snail and the snail's shell. It's connected. They're connected to one another. That's a level of God consciousness that the Baal Shem Tov, in any case, saw as the highest spiritual achievement. Now, what he emphasizes here in the parable is that it's something that's very difficult to reach, because in effect, we have these walls of illusion and so many things in the world that try to get us to believe that we're separate, that we're alone, that we're in darkness, that Hashem doesn't know, that there is evil in the world, all of the things that most people would say, well, that's reality. And I guess the point here being that there are two stages here. There's one stage of perhaps knowing that one can go beyond a wall and another wall and another wall. And then there's the stage of actually doing it. So the question is, how do you pierce those walls? How do you break through them? How do you really defeat that illusion? I think that the key word here is that the king's beloved son was driven by longing to see his father. In other words, everyone else who wanted to see the king, find the king, they wanted to get to the king, but even more, they wanted the treasures. And when they found the treasures along the way, at some point, each of them said that was enough. The king's son didn't want the treasures. He wanted the king. He wanted to get close to the king, and it's this desire or the sense of not having the treasure, the real treasure, that drives him along. So here, I guess we could say is the message of this particular parable, and I would like to say the message, or one message, important message of Hasidism in general, is the task of realizing. When we realize, then something will happen. In other words, the power of Hasidic teaching, what the Baal Shem Tov here is trying to convey as the power of Hasidic teaching, is that engaging in a spiritual practice can actually change reality. Evil can be destroyed, evil can be overcome, the world can be repaired, but it's a matter of becoming actively engaged in the process. I think I will stop here. I would really like to hear any questions that you have. Actually, I did want to just sort of share this picture with you. Excuse me one more minute. Painting by Ruth Feldman, which every time I look at this picture, I feel that it just sort of conveys the message of this parable in such an eloquent way. We have here this luminosity, the face of the king, which can potentially break through the darkness. It reflects here down in our world. There are a lot of barriers and a lot of clouds and illusion, but there's this hope as well that if you can focus your gaze on what's beyond the revealed world, there is this promise of actually confronting the face of the king. Okay, now I need to figure out how to, just a second, how to give people the power to talk. Oh, I think you already are. Yes, anybody want to ask a question?
I think
Yes, please go ahead.
your microphone has to be adjusted for next week. You come in very muffled or gargled, or if you could do something about the mic next week, we would appreciate it.
I'm so sorry. Okay, I will work on that. All right, thank you.
How can we
Norm?
Norm. Hi. So
Norm.
how does Hasidism deal with without bread there's no Torah?
Okay, I will answer that. I understand what you're getting at. I am not going to talk about real live Hasidim and how they live their lives or don't live their lives. I'm not a social historian, and I won't be able to talk about real Hasidim and the ones that are walking around in our world. I'm just doing Hasidic teaching. So that's a great question, but is not for this series. Okay.
Do we access your source?
Joel, I'm sorry. Yes, go ahead again.
Can we access your source material? Your
Can I ask the source?
your sheets, your sources.
The sources, they're on the website, and at the beginning of the first chat, I actually sent the link again. Okay, so you should be able to access it there.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello.
Yes.
Hi. I thought it was a very lovely talk. I've written you a private message on your thing.
Yes.
Are you going to talk about something that somebody asked me to write about, and I don't think I'm up to it? Is why there was really the big dispute really between the Baal Shem Tov and the Vilna Gaon. Somebody has asked me to write about that myself. I mean, it's a very difficult one because he was interested in Kabbalah. It's not as if he was not interested in mysticism, you know, as you know. I just wonder whether anyone has done anything on that and whether you are going to touch on this in your series at all.
I definitely, quite a lot written about that. I can send you some.
So
some
nice,
sources
and
on
I
that. Yes,
do read Hebrew. I don't know Lithuanian. I can read. I mean, I've lived and worked in Israel, just in case, and other languages. I'll write, if you could send your email, I'll write to you privately. I thought it was a lovely piece that you did. Really nice.
You know what?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Oh, wait. Here. How do I write a message to everyone?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Oh,
Yes.
thank It just occurred to me, I'm just wondering if this has all been treated. You know, in Western civilization, we have that great cultural literacy top 10 of Plato's cave and the idea of seeing shadows on the cave. And I'm wondering if anyone's ever made that connection with the parable and with the text that you raised in that notion of breaking through the shadows, or breaking through these kinds of walls that of appearances.
That's a great association. I'm pretty sure, I know in a Hebrew article that someone has made that connection. If there's anything in English, I'm not sure. I could check on that. I'll try to get some sources for next week.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, if anybody wrote on the chat, I didn't read a single thing, but hopefully I'll have, I'm looking forward to hearing what people wrote, and I hope to respond next week. So thank you all for coming, and